Hey everyone, welcome to an Advanced Sports Analytics live stream. Today is Monday, June 14th. We had a bit of a crazy week last week and didn't get any streams out, but we're now in round 2 of the playoffs. Kind of the number of games decreasing, but we still got a good 2 games. The Clippers versus Jazz. That's the late game. So I'm joined by Charles Mornay today. He's been managing our NBA projections for much of the playoffs to talk through the 2-game standard multiplier format slate as well as the champion format. So welcome, Charles. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So we'll jump right into the 2-game slate and can pull up our projections for the slate. You can get to these, by the way, just the NBA drop down, the fast break projections. If you are an ASA subscriber, selecting all 4 teams, SuperDraft, the classic, standard format. So when we look at our projections and kind of look at some of the top players, does seem that we're seeing much of the value, at least among kind of the top tier players in that Utah LAC game. I guess we can start with guard. We have Mitchell as the top projected post multiplier play on the slate. And beyond Mitchell, I think, Mitchell is looking like a lock, with no Conley, expects to get a ton of usage, play a ton of minutes. But as we move past Mitchell, I do think some decisions have to be made between our kind of second and third guard. So among some of the other non-Mitchell guards, who is standing out to you as potential plays for cash?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting. Obviously, Trae Young is next there on our projections, and he was very impressive in game 1, and game 2 and 3 loss. Vegas is projecting this 4th game to be pretty close, so I definitely like him there. I think he had 23 field goal attempts in game 1 and 16 and 17 and 2 and 3. So if we see him bounce back to those game 1 numbers, which I think they should be doing, then I would love him. And then after that, it gets there's a bit of a drop off. You got Ben Simmons, Bogdan, even Batum, who you could plug in, and then some Reggie Jackson and Seth Curry. I mean, those 2 higher multiplier guys, Reggie Jackson and Seth Curry, it's hard to know what Ty Lue's doing out there with the Clippers. These kind of non-centerpieces can have 35 minutes or they can have 20 minutes. So it's definitely a risk to play him. But, I mean, game 2, he was 11 and 19. So I'm seeing some interest down there. But I like building around Mitchell and Trae, and then some exposure to some of those other guys.
Yeah, it does seem Mitchell and Trae are probably cash game locks. They just are the best offensive player on their respective teams. Probably they have, and I would say both Utah and Atlanta are the least balanced, offenses, especially with no Conley. Like the Clippers, you could see their production being spread out between George or Leonard, or even you mentioned guys like Reggie Jackson. Philadelphia, they can spread it out between Embiid, Harris, Simmons, Curry, even like Shake Milton could get going off the bench. But Utah and Atlanta does feel pretty condensed, and obviously you're paying pretty heavy price for them. I mean, Embiid I think is the low multiplier on the slate, and then Mitchell and Young are both along with Leonard the second lowest multiplier, most expensive players on the slate. But in a short slate like this, I think during the regular season, we typically would have kind of favorable projections for some of these mid to high multiplier players. But playoffs, they're just fewer games. Teams are tightening up their rotation a good bit. So I do think it makes sense to certainly for cash game purposes, be conservative with Young and Mitchell, not try to think too much. Try to think too much outside of the box. The Simmons, I think Simmons is where things, are up for discussion. We've got him projected pretty well ahead of the next guard option in Bogdanovic. That's Bogdan, Atlanta. So we got both Bogdanovics playing tonight. So Atlanta, Bogdan. Um, but Simmons can be kind of hot and cold. He does have these games where he's sometimes just only looking to distribute and not particularly high usage. I mean, we have him at 17% projected usage, which is just a function of field goal attempts, free throw attempts, and turnovers. So Simmons is obviously going to play up for his assist upside, and then he's a good defensive player. But to me, Simmons seems like a guy I might be willing to depart from for tournament purposes. I mean, he does have like good triple-double type upside, but just seems like this year he really hasn't flashed that huge upside the way he has in previous years. And in the playoffs, I think has been fairly quiet. And as you mentioned, it might make sense to try to take shots on some of these volatile Clippers guys who have these really high multipliers. If Batum gets like variance working his way in terms of shot attempts, or Reggie Jackson, same thing. Like could see them put up reasonably good scores, and at the high multiplier, it does feel like they have some pretty good upside. Utah Bogdanovich seems interesting. I mean, with Conley out, it does seem like the absence of Conley kind of raises the floor and ceiling of just about all the guys in those starting lineups, in that Utah starting lineup. I mean, obviously Mitchell is going to really benefit from Conley out, but among guys like, and we can kind of transition to forward even, among guys like O'Neal, Bogdanovich, Ingles, who, we have down here, he's got a pretty low multiplier. I mean, and even Clarkson coming off the bench. I mean, of these non-Mitchell Jazz guys, are there any that you kind of have your eyes on as a primary beneficiary from Conley being out?
I mean, what Slate's in is probably Ingles and Clarkson. I mean, Clarkson has been incredible, and he's been almost consistently taking the second most shots on this team. So I do like exposure there, but the issue is he's priced like it. I mean, he's got a 1.2 multiplier. I mean, it's crazy to justify a 1.2 from him when you could get a 1.15 from Mitchell or Trae Young. And then Ingles is definitely an option. I think he's priced similarly, like a bit poorly at that 1.35. He's really got to get going early and then take the shots. So, I mean, Mitchell coming off those 30, 29, and his lowest 24 attempts, 40 points. It's a game that slates to be close. I mean, it's hard to imagine that there's anyone else on the team worth playing. It almost seems like he's mispriced when you see Clarkson at 1.2. So.
Yeah, they've done I think a good job of pricing up Clarkson as if Conley will be out, which he's questionable, but he's been questionable to out the last couple games. Does feel like maybe like O'Neal or Bogdanovich are the guys that kind of lag behind in terms of maybe they weren't priced up quite as aggressively, and Gobert as well. Could make the same case for like Ingles, but I mean him and Bogdanovich are like similar. It's just Bogdanovich will play more minutes, be higher usage. Ingles can be streaky though as a shooter, but from a medium projection and kind of floor projection standpoint, I feel like Bogdanovich is probably the guy I'd be interested in. Let's see. And then, I mean, do any of these guys, we're talking about some of these Utah guys, but it does seem, and based on our projections, that the optimal approach would be to go towards the Clipper forwards, Harris. It seems like our projections are not super interested in messing around with some of these like high multiplier, high upside, but potentially low floor Jazz options. For cash game purposes, do you see any reason to get away from this kind of top tier of forwards and George, Leonard, and Harris? I guess Embiid categorizes as a forward as well. So, I mean, really those four guys, do you see any reason in cash to get away from those guys?
I mean, No, it's hard to justify except for just kind of having some exposure to less likely guys for some optimal lineups. But I mean, the way these games have gone, and Vegas is projecting close games kind of in both of them, so we expect this is even more common of a gameplay where these guys are just taking every shot in the fourth quarter. It's really hard to go away from. I like getting some Embiid exposure with switching out with Tobias Harris at forward and then getting some Gobert in there. But yeah, it's hard to make a case to go in another direction except for if you're going to play a lot of lineups and you want some more exposure across the board.
Yeah. Leonard or Batum could be one guy to consider as like a tournament pivot off those two guys. I think just by virtue of being he will play a lot of minutes in this starting lineup with George and Leonard. So like obviously for cash game purposes, I think trying to play as close to optimal makes sense. For tournament purposes though, like I expect Leonard and George to be insanely popular. And, there is, I think, an element of wanting to try to build some lineups or allocate some lineups that are likely to succeed when the chalk fails. And I do think Batum is a guy who just has like natural leverage off of George and Leonard, and also with the high multiplier. Like if either of George or Leonard fail and maybe they cede, a couple extra shots to Batum with the high multiplier, like he does have the ability to give you a guy that can help you leapfrog, droves of lineups who are going to be, locked in on chalky Leonard and George. Let's see, at the forward position, are there any other guys? Like, I even see like Royce O'Neal as a potential. I do think Mitchell is going to be really, really hard to get away from tonight. But like, if you were setting aside some lineups to like fade Mitchell and maybe go with like Gobert at center, slide Embiid into forward, like O'Neal, or maybe even Bogdanovich. Like, but O'Neal like could be a guy that maybe takes a couple extra like unforeseen shots. He's usually a low usage guy, but if he can sneak his way into 2 or 3 extra 3-point attempts that he shoots at a high percentage, like that would be a guy maybe I keep an eye on. Are there any other kind of forward, kind of off optimal forwards that you're considering maybe for tournament purposes?
Yeah, well, similar to you, I love Batum and getting away from it. And Ty Lue's been so hard to predict, but the biggest difference, they go 0-2, and then Batum gets that starting spot, 35 minutes, kind of take minutes away from everyone else, and they get the win in game 3. It seems like it'd be crazy if you didn't get the 35, 36 minutes tonight, which obviously gives him, the rebounds and the shots. I think he had 9 shot attempts last game, shoots threes, gets boards. I mean, the 1.7 feels really, really good there in terms of
value. So I'm doing with our just our optimizer. I like for tournament purposes, like if I'm building 20 lineups or so throwing in some kind of variance criteria. So like giving the projection some randomness, some bounce and stuff. And when you try to put some diversification into your builds, like I'm just doing 20 optimal build and getting Batum in 40% of those lineups. So I think he seems like probably the best kind of high multiplier candidate to take some shots on. Let's see. And then moving along to center, it's probably I guess, Capella's in there, but it's probably like a three candidate discussion at center. In previous nights, we've been really, really high on Gobert, such that Embiid has only been really a consideration at forward. But tonight, it looks like we actually have a higher projection on Embiid. I'm not sure. Yeah, I guess that's just a minutes thing. His minutes have been ticking up. So with more minutes projected for Embiid than we have seen earlier in the series. I mean, for you, does he kind of leapfrog Gobert as your preferred center, or are you kind of sticking with the high value defense that Gobert brings to the slate?
Yeah, I mean they're pretty close for me here. Obviously, with the projection of a close game tonight, if Gobert, gets that high end of the minutes and we see another like 20 rebound night like he had in game 2, I mean, it's just a lot. But as you mentioned, Embiid, he looks healthy, the knee looks good. And I mean, he's just, the center that can end up taking 25 shots and get 15 boards. I mean, he's just been an absolute monster. So I like it. I like exposure to both. I mean, if I had to pick one, I'd probably trust the model and take the Embiid here with how it's setting up. But I don't think either of them is too wrong here.
Yeah. Would be interesting. I mean, so do you see like a guy like Capella having really any avenue to outscoring like both of these guys at 1.2x? So it's the same multiplier as Gobert. Seems pretty thin to me, but I imagine Capella will get like next to no ownership.
Yeah, I mean, and that would be really the only reason to play him is hope for that. And I mean, I just don't see it. It's even when he's getting these 30 minutes. I mean, he's still not having a game. It would have to be at the highest end of his outcomes in order for it to be worth it. And I don't think it's priced appropriately.
Yeah. His usage like just hasn't been. He was, I think. I'm not going to say a focal point of the Atlanta offense throughout the season, but certainly I think his kind of role during the playoffs has decreased a good bit. It seems like Atlanta's really just, funneling their shots to Young and Bogdanovic. So it does seem a bit thin. I mean, you would need him to get, a massive rebound game, I think, is within his range of outcomes and the blocks even, but he just hasn't been doing quite enough on the offensive side. Well, it'll be interesting to see how ownership plays out. I mean, naturally, Embiid's going to be higher owned because he's got the dual position eligibility. And I guess it's kind of not your traditional like center binary decision. You could go Embiid and Gobert. So I do expect Gobert to be plenty popular with people rostering Embiid at forward. All right, why don't we talk? So that I think for me covers the main slate. Anything you want to add before we jump over to the single game?
No, I think that was pretty well covered.
All right. So yeah, single game format, champion mode format on SuperDraft. Let's see. Oh, I gotta click over to Showdown. So it's interesting. I mean, just one thing that jumps out to me, Leonard and his classic multiplier format. You do get 1.1 on Mitchell compared to 1 flat on Leonard, and to me that just seems like a good opportunity to be high on Mitchell. He is at the top of our post multiplier projections. But yeah, I mean, Leonard is up there. I think this series, just the stars have really shined so far through this. Mitchell feels a lot. But with only the single game, we are going to have to take some shots on some of these higher multiplier guys. Who to you stands out? Maybe we'll start with kind of the high multiplier players. Who for you stands out as some of the high multiplier players that you want to consider for as kind of your cash game guys, and then also guys that you consider for tournament purposes?
Yeah. So, I mean, kind of the guys we slate in up top here, Royce O'Neal and Bogan, who we alluded to like a Royce Neal game outcome. I mean, he's been an absolute monster defensively, and obviously that's huge in the scoring for SuperDraft. And then, I mean, even some optimal builds, he was, showing up in the captain and showing up there. I mean, that the 2.1 multiplier for a guy who could even get upwards of 40 minutes. And as you mentioned, if we get a little higher variance in terms of shots, he's an easy slate winner, and probably a guy who doesn't project a lot of ownership. So it's a good option there. And then Bogan, who I like, I think he's, we're showing some value there, and he's definitely worth some options. But I think another guy we alluded to earlier, Batum, who's, had the monster game, and that monster game 3 and the big win, bounce back. Really, it's hard to see him not having that same type of role in this game. Expect him to start, expect him to get 34, 35 minutes, especially if it's close down the end. And if we see, another night where he gets 6, 7 3-point attempts and he can do work in the rest of the stat sheet, that at 2.15, really offers some great upside. And if either of George or Kawhi is cold, and we've seen Paul George be cold in the playoffs plenty of times, Batum could be the next recipient for those shots. So that's where I'd be looking tonight.
And new player to gravitate in the multiplier format. The range of possible multipliers is pretty narrow, between 1 and 2x, and really in the playoffs, the range for play is kind of between like 1 and 1.7. But with the champion mode, the range of play multipliers ranges between 1 and 3, and then you have relevant players, like guys who will be playing significant, even big. Terrence Mann, Beverly, these are guys that we're projecting for non-trivial minutes, with just like huge 2.5, 2.7 multipliers. We don't have super strong projections on them, but definitely think it's a format where you do have to pay careful attention to players' multipliers and not be afraid to, and especially like on a slate like tonight where we're seeing pretty tight projections between like the top, looks like top like dozen or so players, not be afraid to plug in like a guy like Bogdanovich or O'Neal at champion. Not saying, if you're running 10 lineups, you want to go like, half of them with Royce O'Neal at champion. But I think there is an oversaturation in champion exposure to the name brand, the recognizable, the safe kind of the players that feel safe. We have seen slates before where, guys like Facundo Campazzo, wins the champion slate at, 2x plus. We've seen Bogdanovich win slates, Atlanta's Bogdanovich win slates in the Atlanta New York series. And so, I do think there's a slate where you could consider going like guys like O'Neal or Bogdanovich or Batum as, champion sprinkles. So one thing I noticed that's kind of interesting and just worth pointing out, I think we try to point it out in a lot of our articles, but so the math behind the champion multipliers, it's 50%, 150% of the player's utility multiplier. So for Mitchell, that's 1.1 times 1.5, so 1.65. Paul George, however, is 1.15 times 1.5, and you get this number that is 3 significant digits. SuperDraft will round him up to 1.75. So like we actually have Mitchell as a better utility projection than George by a very slim margin. But when we're running our optimals, we actually get more champion George exposure because of that like rounding nuance. So not like, I don't think you need to like have a strict rule of like, we'll only play, guys who have like a trailing 0.5 in their multiplier, but definitely being cognizant of kind of some of that rounding and multiplier nuance, I think just highlights like how, I guess, sensitive and kind of attentive we need to be to players' multipliers. And then studs we didn't talk about, like Leonard, Gobert, I think both make for strong plays. probably would gravitate more towards Mitchell. I even think of like Leonard, even though our projections are more favorable towards George, I do think Leonard has kind of a higher floor. And I don't know, maybe I'm kind of biased by some of George's past playoff performances. When we touched on Jordan Clarkson a little bit, it seemed you would agree probably he's got like a equally efficient price in the champion mode, right? He seems kind of like a lower consideration. Yeah, I don't know any of these other like high multiplier guys, Jackson. Would you go down to like Terrence Mann or Beverly, who just have these massive multipliers?
So I think it's worth considering like a sprinkle of these guys. I mean, the Clippers have been the least consistent team in terms of minute play. I mean, like Terrence Mann game 2 gets 1 minute played, and then game 3 gets 22 minutes played, and 7 points, 4 rebounds, an assist. I mean, that's a game 3 win, game 2 loss. Maybe he's slated. I think it's worth, if you're going to enter 10 lineups, it's worth having one where you put a guy like, Terrence Mann with that 2.5 in it, maybe champion, or sprinkle him in a lineup just to have that, variance outcome covered, especially with a team like this. Most teams, it wouldn't be worth it because you wouldn't see in this type of variance, but definitely worth sprinkling. I mean, we have a relatively significant value for Terrence Mann in this, I mean, he's still down the board, but so someone like him, Pat Bev, kind of same situation. It was almost, looked like he wasn't going to play at all. It was like Pat Bev was taken out and Rondo played, and now we've switched back. Rondo's out, Pat Bev's playing. So I like exposure to each of those guys maybe in a little bit if you're going to play a bunch of lineups.
Yeah. You touch on like kind of just the fragility of projections, and we're trying to project kind of the median outcome, or either the most likely outcome as far as minutes go, or kind of binary outcomes. Like Zubac has been a guy where he will play, like you said, like 1 minute, and then, or he might play 20 minutes. I think we kind of lean towards the latter as, a true center to match up against Gobert. But yeah, the Clippers have been, very, very fragile from like a projection standpoint, and, maybe setting rule one of, say, Beverly or Mann, just because, it seems unlikely that there are multiple deep Clippers that get a ton of run, but there are avenues to like one of the deeper Clippers getting significant run, and they'll probably come in at super low ownership. So well, that's all I got. Anything you want to add to this single game slate? I think SuperDraft, they have a number of kind of multi-entry $500,000 prizes up top, I believe. So it should be some good contests. I think our projections have been really strong for the single game stuff. Anything you want to add before we close out?
No, I think it's a good slate tonight. I'm excited to play it.
Yeah, definitely a number of ways you can go, especially this Utah Clippers game. I think is fun. There's a number of Utah role players you can go with. As kind of Conley substitutes, and we touched on some of the deep Clippers guys. So that'll about do it. Good luck to everyone tonight. We're going to try to be back tomorrow and do a US Open SuperDraft podcast, or live stream rather, touching on some of the it's a really strong field, and I think should be a good tournament. SuperDraft has the major sized tournaments out for the weekend. So we will be back tomorrow, Brandon and I, to cover the US Open. So tune in then. And then we'll be back. I think Charles will be back Wednesday to go over NBA again. We got another 2-gamer on Wednesday. So good luck to everyone tonight.
Awesome.